So the first part of this module will be looking at the ethics of doing research on human subjects, which is perhaps the area that has been most responsible historically for the development of practical ethics as a discipline. So in the middle of the 20th century, there were many examples of horrific medical research practices. Probably most well known are the experiments done by Nazi doctors on concentration camp and the experiments done by Japanese medics in occupied Manchuria. But these practices continued after the Second World War as well. For example, the now infamous Tuskegee study involved infecting Black American men with syphilis without their knowledge and without their informed consent, and that continued up until the 1970s. So it was practical ethics developed partly as a response to these atrocities in medical research. And of course, we now have better regulations governing medical research, but there are still ethically controversial aspects to medical research or research on human subjects more generally, and these will be the focus of this module. So for example, one issue is when it's ethically acceptable to randomize individuals to receiving a placebo rather than receiving a medical treatment that's being tested. So one view would be it's okay to randomize people to placebo if there's no accepted medical treatment for the disease being studied, and if there's what's called genuine equipoise, which means there's genuine uncertainty about whether the treatment being studied is actually more beneficial than placebo or not. But there are interesting ethical questions about, for example, how we should understand equipoise. Is there equipoise if the scientist doing the study is almost certain that the treatment is superior to placebo but has sort of some shadow of doubt about its effectiveness? Is there equipoise if some scientists think the treatment is clearly better than placebo, but other scientists think the reverse? These are some of the sorts of questions that need to be considered. Similarly, there are questions about what should count as an established or accepted medical treatment. So suppose that some scientists are doing a study in a poorer developing country, and in that country there's no routine treatment for the disease being studied. Does that mean that we should say there's no accepted treatment and we could randomize people to receiving placebos? Or should we look at what treatments would be available in richer countries? Another example of the sort of question that will be addressed in this part of the module is the ethics of offering incentives for participation in medical research. So many medical studies participants are compensated financially for the time that they take off work and the travel costs and so on. But there are questions about whether they could be paid over and above that, whether we could offer them sort of positive financial incentives to encourage more people to participate. Possible ethical concern here is that if we start paying large sums of money, this might be coercive, and that might be regarded as ethically problematic. And to assess that concern, we'd need to look at what is coercion and when and why is it ethically problematic. And another worry is that in some cases offering people financial incentives to participate in research might actually make people less inclined to participate for altruistic reasons, and therefore might actually decrease the number of people participating. So the second part of the module will focus on empirical ethics. Traditionally, philosophers working in ethics have tended to do what's called armchair ethics or armchair philosophy. So they have started their reflections about ethical problems just by reflecting on their own intuitive views about particular real life or hypothetical cases. But recently there's been a move towards what's known as empirical ethics, which involves, for example, surveying the public to get their views on real or hypothetical cases. And one question is how that kind of empirical work can contribute to ethical discussions. So to give an example, one sort of case that ethicists have spent quite a lot of time thinking about is the kind of case where you have to make a decision between, say, allowing 10 people to die or more actively causing the death of a smaller number of people. So in a famous case proposed by Bernard Williams, you are asked to imagine that you've stumbled across an army captain who's about to kill 10 innocent people who he's taken hostage, and he makes you an offer, which is that if you kill one of these people, then he'll let the other 9 go free. And the standard way that philosophers have thought about those kinds of cases is just to reflect on them themselves and wonder, what would I do in that case, or what should I do in that kind of case, and then take that kind of judgment as the starting point for their ethical discussions. But The empirical ethics approach would be more to actually go out there and survey members of the public about what they think someone should do when faced with this kind of ethical quandary. So then the question is, what should we do with the information that we might get from these surveys? Clearly, the fact that a lot of members of the public hold some ethical position doesn't necessarily mean that that position is justified or correct. It may be that in many societies we could survey people and find out that most people think that it's ethically objectionable to be in a mixed race relationship, for example, and clearly it wouldn't follow from that that we should think that that is actually ethically objectionable or ethically problematic. But on the other hand, it does seem as though it's somehow problematic for philosophers to just rely on their own kinds of potentially idiosyncratic views about cases and ignore what the rest of the population thinks. So one question is, how, if at all, are the views of the public relevant?